Welcome to the lecture series on reinforcement learning and the brain. In this video I will talk about synaptic plasticity and show that synaptic plasticity is the basis of learning rules in the brain. And in particular we'll look at Heppian learning and observations of long-term potentiation called LTP. Learning happens in many different situations. We can learn to ride a bike. We can learn to play tennis or play the violin. In all these cases, it's learning of actions, and this action learning is reward-based. You are happy when you learn to ride a bike if you make the first 100 meters. You are unhappy if you fall down. So you have feedback, positive or negative feedback, and this is part of the reward signal. There's a different type of learning, and that's remembering episodes, like your first day as a student at EPFL, or your first visit in a new city. Say you are the first time in Manhattan, you take the subway, you get out of the subway station, you look around. There's no reward here, and nevertheless, you will remember the surroundings. All these cases, whether it's reward-based or not reward-based, must be learned by mechanisms implemented in the brain. In the first case, it's model of action choices. In the second case, it's models of the world. Now, how does this learning work? Inside the brain, if you zoom in, we'll have groups of neurons. Here, each neuron is just a little yellow circle. They are connected to each other. Let's focus on one of the neurons. And then this neuron has a part that would be the yellow circle, which is the soma, the central part of the neuron. The neuron gets input from other neurons on a part that's called the dendrite, and it sends out signals itself. And these signals move along the cable called the axon. So here's the dendrite, that's where the signals arrive. Here is the axon, that's where the output signal is sent along. And what are these signals? These signals are short pulses called spikes. Now let's look at the connection. A signal arrives from another neuron. It arrives at a connection point that's called the synapse. The synapse has a complicated biochemical structure that's not interesting for us. What matters for us is that if a signal moves in, comes in to that contact point, then it evokes a response. So pulse comes in, a spike comes in, it evokes a response, and this response has a certain amplitude. And now it turns out that this amplitude, which measures the strength of the response, that this amplitude is not fixed, but it can change. Now, synaptic plasticity is a change in the connection strength. And synaptic plasticity is thought to be the basis of learning. We can describe these changes of the response as a change in the amplitude of what's called the postsynaptic potential. I remind you, the synapse is the connection point. The sending neuron is the one before the synapse, is called presynaptic. The receiving neuron is after the synapse, is called postsynaptic, and the amplitude of the response is the amplitude of the postsynaptic voltage or postsynaptic potential, sometimes called PSP. Now here's again my neuron. I've turned it around. This is the dendrite. On this dendrite I have a contact point. Now we zoom in on this contact point, and this neuron down here is the receiving neuron, is the postsynaptic neuron. And on the postsynaptic side, so this would be the cable, the dendrite. And then here on this postsynaptic side, we have a postsynaptic bouton, also called spike. And then the signal arrives via the axon, and it arrives on the presynaptic terminal. And there's another of these boutons, presynaptic terminal. Now the postsynaptic bouton, I should say, can be made visible. So here's the dendrite, and this is where the triangle points, is one of these postsynaptic spines. And the spine is a measure of the size of the connection, of the size of the synapse, of the strength of the connection. Now in this experiment, they give a signal, which I will explain later, and after this signal, this spine starts to grow. It's a very weak, small signal here. Before and afterwards, after 50 minutes, it becomes a very strong signal. Which means the size of the contact point has grown, and it implies indirectly that the synapse itself has been strengthened. The synapse, the contact point, has become stronger. So let's summarize. Connections can be strong or weak. Strong connections have thick spines that can be visualized with experimental techniques, and synaptic plasticity means a change of connection. And now the field of neuroscience claims that synaptic plasticity is the basis of learning. So it should enable learning, and learning comes in different forms. Learning could mean memorizing facts and episodes, learning where we are, and that would be the current state, learning a model of the world, that would be predicting the future, learning appropriate actions. So learning the model of the world might be related to model-based reinforcement learning. Learning appropriate actions is clearly the task of reinforcement learning. Learning where we are means we need a good representation of states. So many things that are relevant for reinforcement learning is related to synaptic plasticity, at least potentially. Now, synaptic plasticity means connection points can change. I look at the connection Wij from a sending neuron, presynaptic neuron J, to a receiving neuron I. Now the sending neuron sends out its spikes. It's as a function of time. We have several spike trains. The red neuron has spikes, the green neuron has spikes, and now there's a statement formulated by Donald Hebb. When an axon of cell J repeatedly or persistently takes part in firing cell I, then J's efficiency as one of the cells firing I is increased. The weight is increased. The weight is increased depending on a local condition. The increase depends on the activity of the sending neuron, and it depends on the activity of the receiving neuron. It's a local rule. It only needs information from the sender and the receiver. And somehow it's changed, it's increased if the two are simultaneously active. Local rule means that other neurons K that also connect to I don't influence the learning, the change of this connection Wij directly. Indirectly, of course, K will contribute to the activity of the postsynaptic neuron I. The claim is, a local rule is, if the influence is not direct, but only indirect. Here is a particular nice protocol, experimental protocol of Hebbian co-activation. You stimulate a presynaptic neuron, the green neuron, with a single pulse, and then you stimulate the receiving neuron, the orange neuron, with 3 pulses. So you have a sequence pre, post, 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 or ping, pong, 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 and then you repeat it. Ping, pong, 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 ping, pong, 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 ping, pong, pong, pong. You repeat this for several times. And so the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron are active together, co-stimulated repeatedly, and the result of this, the connection between these two neurons gets stronger, and we see this in this increase in the spine of the synapse that connects to the green neuron. Importantly, another input line, the red neuron, which is not active, does not increase its synapse. Here's another visualization of the same idea. I have 2 neurons, a presynaptic neuron J and a postsynaptic neuron I, connected by weight Wij. To test the strength of the weight, the presynaptic neuron emits a spike, and we record the response, the size of the postsynaptic potential of the postsynaptic neuron. And then we give the Heppian protocol, which means both neurons are simultaneously active. And afterwards, sometime later, we test again with the single pulse the response. And now we see that this response amplitude has increased, and that is an indication that the weight of this connection is increased, the synaptic connection is stronger. So why is the name of this stimulation protocol a protocol of long-term plasticity or long-term potentiation, or LTP? Well, the stimulation protocol pre, post, 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 or here just pre-post, 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 you repeat it maybe 60 times at 20 Hertz, so it's less than 3 seconds. The induction protocol that causes the change is super short. However, you can send the test pulse 30 minutes later and the synapse is still strong. 30 minutes, an hour, that's the typical duration of an experiment, but it can persist for several hours, it can persist for days, potentially even for a whole lifetime. So long-term plasticity means that changes persist. Here is now a specific protocol that's called spike timing dependent plasticity. It is a Heppian protocol because the two neurons that are connected are active together. And here the idea is that the spike of the sending neuron comes about 10 milliseconds before the spike of the postsynaptic neuron. But then you repeat this 60 times. So it's ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, 60 times. And now if during these repetitions the presynaptic spike comes always before the postsynaptic spike by about 10 milliseconds, then the synapse is increased. If the timing were the other way around, then the synapse would decrease its strength. And now the important point is this change is induced in a second or 2 or 3 seconds, but it lasts for a very long time. Therefore, it's an example of co-activation that leads to long-term plasticity, LTP. So let's summarize. Synaptic plasticity makes connections stronger or weaker. There are experimental protocols that allow us to induce such a change. Synaptic plasticity typically needs joint activation of the two connected neurons. And that's an example of a Heppian activation protocol. And then importantly, it's induced rapidly, but it can persist for a very, very long time, hours or even days. And spike timing dependent plasticity, called STDP, is one of these protocols. A short formulation of the Hep rule is neurons that fire together, wire together, and the Hep rule and also the F rule of long-term potentiation, they are local rules, because what matters is the activity of the sending and the activity of the receiving neuron, but not of some third neuron farther away. So local learning rule means that only local information is used. So if you think of a sending neuron J, a receiving neuron I, pre and post, then this synapse Wij, this synapse knows that a spike goes across, so it knows about presynaptic activity. It also knows the state of the receiving neuron, the state of the postsynaptic neuron. And therefore, a general formulation of a local learning rule would be to say the change depends on the state of the presynaptic neuron, the spikes that it sends. It depends on the state of the postsynaptic neuron. The state could be defined by spikes, but also just by an elevation of the voltage of the potential. And then, of course, the weight itself is also a quantity that's locally available at the synapse. To summarize, in Heppian learning, changes depend on two factors: a presynaptic factor, for example, spike arrival, and then you can think of low-pass filtering the spike, and this would give a variable xj. And it can depend on a postsynaptic factor, which is the activation or the output spike or the increase in voltage of the postsynaptic neuron, and let's call this the variable phi. And then with this formulation, the weight change depends on xi, on phi, and on the weight itself. And the specific formulation would be to say that this co-activation comes in the form of a product. The presynaptic factor xj is multiplied with the postsynaptic factor, and b is a parameter of bias, so phi minus b together makes up the postsynaptic factor. And then if I have this joint activity between pre and post, then this synapse up here is strengthened. So the strengthening process depends on coincidences of pre and post. So let's summarize this in a little quiz. Standard long-term potentiation has an acronym LTP. Takes more than 10 minutes to induce. That's wrong, but it lasts more than 30 minutes. It depends on presynaptic activity and on the state of the postsynaptic neuron, and that is correct. Then we can look at Heppian learning and STTP. Heppian learning depends on presynaptic activity and on the state of the postsynaptic neuron. Yes, this is true, and that means Heppian learning can induce long-term potentiation. Final question. STTP is a special case of Heppian learning. If presynaptic spikes precede postsynaptic spikes repeatedly by 10 milliseconds, LTP is induced. And yes, this is correct.